Connecting up to any of your data sources like SharePoint Online or OneDrive, all of that metadata comes through automatically. You don't need to think about it. But there's been that problem that people have always come to us and gone, well, what if there's other metadata we wanted to add to objects? Of course, you could add that as custom fields throughout those systems, but not all data sources support those extra fields. File shares is a really, really good example. There's also other regulations where you're required to add additional metadata to items that may not necessarily be available inside those source systems. Let's talk a little bit about that. So certainly, if we look at the traditional record, we've got a bunch of details there about the file path, the title, the author, all of the source data that comes from the custom system, and any intelligence signals that we might pull through, like classification, intelligence, etc., to help classify that object. But we're actually talking about systems that are outside of those source systems. Imagine if you had a project manager working with a project system and they're finishing off the project and they put the closure date in that project system. Wouldn't it be great if all of that information came across to those related records? Or if you're a business doing shared services, being able to understand where the cost center is related to for a particular SharePoint site or particular set of files or records being managed. What if you wanted to manage consent, customer-based consent on you having particular information about them, opt-in, opt-out settings, or even just as simple as the application status, for example, either on a loan or maybe a student application, and knowing whether or not you need to keep those records based on those outcomes. These are just simple examples, but certainly any other metadata that you could think of that could come from a third-party system that isn't where the data is stored can now be applied with what we call our metadata enrichment service. So let's use a couple of examples, say for this example. We've got that project closure. A project manager finishes off the project, closes it in the project management system, but that date of closure isn't naturally assigned to every single object in SharePoint or in a particular file share, for example. With metadata enrichment service, you can actually link that project closure date directly to those files automatically, such that that one action from the project manager would now give you that event-based retention for all of the objects that were a part of that project. Think about it from a HR perspective, the termination of employee, or even just applicants who don't necessarily get through the application process. Knowing whether an application was successful or not, whether an employee was terminated or not, and the date at which that happened will also help you to drive event-based retention. And then even a simpler example, just having the consent from a customer to have access to their private information, knowing that they've given you that consent will determine whether or not you should be keeping these objects inside the Records 365 system. And if any of you have been recently affected by a privacy breach, here in Australia, Optus is a really, really good example and very, very timely. As a former customer, I wouldn't have expected that my driver's license details were still being kept by that organisation. Now, in the case of metadata enrichment, that closure of my account could have driven the event-based retention on the objects that they stored on my About Me, for example.